How can you say that he really exists? I mean, I don't see why. Like, you look at yourself and you said earlier that you look in the mirror and you see yourself as evidence
Yes.
that God exists.
Yes.
You look at humanity and you
Right.
see the hand of God.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm the opposite of you. When I look at God, I see the hand of humanity, and I don't know if you want me to explain why I feel that way.
Sure.
But, okay. The concept of God as it's constructed by Judeo-Christian philosophy, and really most other religions to a lesser extent, but more Judeo-Christian philosophy, or more the Judeo-Christian God than others, is that it's designed in a way to defy logical argumentation. It's designed to function outside the bounds of logic in such a fashion that you can never disprove it, no matter how many backflips you do. So,
It's not true.
how so? How would
Paul
you
writes in
disprove
1
God?
Corinthians 15, if Christ is not risen from the dead, we're a pack of fools for believing in him.
But that's based on documents that are thousands of years old, of questionable accuracy, and based on, moreover, you have legends that predate that are eerily similar to the same story.
Like which one?
How is that different from the mythos?
Like which one?
I'm afraid I don't have specific
That's
examples.
most
I did the reading
unfortunate.
some a while ago.
Very unfortunate. Because those are clearly shown to not be historical in the slightest. It's simply different mythologies. And when you study the mythologies that most closely parallel the Gospels, guess what? They're AD, not BC.
Really?
Like Mithraism, correct. You study Mithraism and you begin to realize that the religion that is, quote, supposedly closest to Christianity
Which one is Mithraism? I'm afraid I don't remember.
began in
names.
Iraq and Iran,
Okay.
worships and the idea of a being slaughtering a bull, and a lot of Roman soldiers and other military people got into this religion, and there's some parallels. But when you begin to study the parallels and begin to nail it down, you begin to realize those parallels were constructed AD. In fact, 200 AD.
What about all the various other myths that, well, I shouldn't say myths, the various other aspects of Christianity that have been predated to, say, 3000 BC, 2000 BC? For example, the story of the parting of the Red Sea, water from stone, all of those. They all have roots in various pagan mythos that stretches back as far as we can go, basically as far as we can measure. So how can you say that the Bible is more accurate than any of the other mythos that people sincerely believed in for a very long time? Why is the Bible more right?
The Bible is not more accurate historically than the Quran is. The Quran is a very accurate presentation of what Muhammad taught. I can promise you the Bible is not more accurate than the record of Siddhartha Gautama Buddha. Siddhartha Gautama Buddha was a real historical person.
Well, I mean, having read several, I've only read one version of the Bible. Having read several versions of the Quran, I have to say that I can't agree with you that it's particularly accurate simply because there's so much disagreement between various forms of the Quran that various forms of Muslims believe in, sincerely, on a factual basis. There's a lot of dispute.
Dispute on what?
On interpretations.
Factual information
interpretations
in
on
the
meanings.
Quran.
All right.
Different interpretations, yes.
I'll give you a
But
specific...
nobody can show that the Quran has not reliably been passed down to us. We have what Muhammad taught very clearly.
Plus 2 generations of oral tradition, but
Yeah.
in which time I'm sure that there was introduced at least some distortion. And then there's mistranslation issues and things like parts of the language dying out over time and then having to be replaced. For example, I don't know if you're familiar with the Syro-Aramaic definitions of terms in Arabic.
No, I'm not.
Well, I'm guessing that everyone here has heard that whole thing about 72 virgins when you die a martyr or whatever, right? I mean, everyone's heard that. It really doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you read it in the context of the passage. It really doesn't make too much sense at all.
Good.
The alternative interpretation is 72 grapes, which were a luxury item at the time. They were a delicacy. It was considered, high luxury to have large amounts of white grapes at your disposal to eat.
Uh-huh.
So that's one of the reinterpretations of it. Now, there's things like that just, that's just one example that I can remember offhand. There are dozens of them. And then there are several disagreements between versions of the faiths regarding various roots of traditions and
Yeah, but
such.
that doesn't change the Quran. That's interpretations that conflict, and
The
that's agreed
stories
on.
do change a little bit. It depends on which version you read. They'll change facts. They'll change dates. They'll change times. It's. I don't think it's as reliable a metric as people make it out to be.
The Caliph Uthman hires Zayd bin Thabit to gather all the different versions of the Quran, and he burns them all and has one. There's a tremendous consistency with that one Quran, and there has been for the past 1,500 years.
But what you just said implies that there were other versions flying around.
Yes, we know that.
Even within Usman was 2 generations, within 2 generations. I'd say that's within 60 years
Yeah.
of the Prophet dying. That's correct?
Yeah, uh-huh.
No, I'd say 40. He was alive at the time.
Right.
So within 40 years, you had dozens of different versions of the Quran flying around to the point that you had to burn them.
Uh-huh.
So now why should we believe that even if we assume that there's only one left, right? Let's just assume that they're consistent. Why should we believe that it's not been warped over time? Especially since we don't really have a physical copy that's older than 1300 AD, something like that, which is a full 600 years after.
Good question. And I hope that critical scholarship will continue to question the reliability of the Quran. I think that's a very good point.
So then, by that logic, why should we not continue to question the reliability of the Bible and the Torah and all the other various books that are flying around? And why do we view them as, why would you consider yourself safe viewing them as an immutable, indubitable document?
I'm not asking you to accept them as an immutable document or infallible or inerrant or anything.
Do you?
I'm simply asking you to accept the Gospels as historically reliable texts.
But that's what you're asking me to do then. You're asking me not to doubt the accuracy of it.
No, I'm asking you to take a hard look at the evidence that points to the historicity, the historical reliability of the Gospels. And for myself, I have used 4 tests to determine historicity of any document. I would encourage you to come up with your own tests that you use to determine historical reliability. Apply them to the Gospels.
What are your 4 tests, if you don't mind my asking?
Internal consistency, literary style, archaeological evidence, and manuscript evidence.
Could you explain literary style?
You bet. Once upon a time in the land of Nod, Wynken, Blynken, and Odd took a boat ride. That's fairy tale. At this time, in this place, with these people around, Jesus said this, he did that. Reads like the New York Times. It's eyewitness reportage. Luke chapter 4 used to put me sound asleep until I began to be concerned about this very issue of historical reliability. Luke chapter 3, excuse me. Forgot my good sleeping medicine here. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the desert. Now, to be honest with you, I could care less about who was tetrarch and all the others. And yet, when you take what Luke writes there in Luke chapter 3 and compare it to the Roman record, what becomes apparent is the guy was a meticulous historian. He had his details right.
Okay, if you were to take off the word of God came to X
Yes.
and replace it with whatever else, would you still be inclined to believe it simply because the historical record was consistent? By that I mean specifically the time frame, the names given of the Roman tetrarchs and such. Would you be inclined to believe it?
Well, when after comparing it to the Roman records and seeing that they were right in line, I would say yes, the text is accurate.
Well, what if he said the word of God came to somebody else instead of John?
Yeah.
Would you believe that?
Well, I would
Let's
read
say
the
it
whole
came to somebody
document.
named Chris.
I would read the whole document, and if it is internally consistent, and if the literary style is historical narrative, and if the archaeological evidence is reliable, and if the manuscript evidence is solid, I'd accept it as historically reliable.
Would you at least agree that that could have been written by anybody with an encyclopedia at the time?
No, because historical fiction was not a literary style used at that point in time, and so that literary style of historical narrative clearly pointed to a claim by the author that this is factual history.
You mean to say that nothing was ever made up at that time in the style of historical fiction, in the style of historical
Narrative?
narrative?
Correct. Historical fiction as a literary style was not invented till hundreds of years after that.
I'm not talking about fiction, pardon me. I'm not talking about fiction. I'm talking about misrepresentation for other ends.
Historical narrative was not used to communicate fiction.
But it could have been used to communicate what was intended to be construed as history.
No, that was not done. That's historical fiction, and that literary style was not used at that point in history.
Are you suggesting that nobody ever lied in the form of a historical narrative at the time?
I am implying that nobody used the historical fiction literary style at that time.
Now, I'm afraid I find that extremely difficult to believe in the context of what I meant by it. I wasn't talking about fiction as in fiction for amusement, or fiction just for kicks. I was talking about writing it deliberately so that it would be construed as a historical document.
Okay, give me an example of what you're talking about.
I don't understand how to give you an example of what I'm talking about. I'm asking you if it could have been written in that style, specifically so that people would believe it even though it was false. Is
Well,
that
anything's possible. Anything's possible. The question is, what does the evidence point to?
And one of the facets of your evidence was literary style. I'm saying that literary style can be easily replicated, that it can be deliberately replicated to promote other ends than what you're saying that it would have promoted.
Okay, fine. So now, in order to validate that, go out and find some examples of what you're talking about.
Fair enough, I'll go hunting on my own, I suppose.
I think that would be a very wise endeavor.
Now, you refer to other evidence, right? You had 3 other types of evidence that you looked to. One of them was internal consistency. I'm not going to address that because I'm not as familiar with the Bible as you are, or really as familiar enough with the Bible to be discussing it in such a manner. What were the other 2?
Archaeological evidence
Okay.
and manuscript evidence.
Okay, manuscript evidence means corresponding manuscripts that corroborate the story.
Manuscript evidence means how many manuscripts of the document do we have? How close to the date of writing are they?
By that, like, copies?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And carbon dated to within a certain time frame?
Yeah, it's pretty hard to carbon date them, but you use other
I suppose
devices
you would
usually.
partially destroy them trying to carbon date them, but how old is the oldest manuscript affirming the notion of God that you hold? Like, how old would you say it would be?
Well, sir, there is no historical narrative of God.
Well,
There's
how
an
about of the
historical
Bible?
narrative of Jesus, how Jesus lived, what he taught. Nobody observed God walking around, right? So, the historical narrative in the Gospels records what people witnessed. They saw Jesus live, they
Sure.
listened to him teach, they saw him die, and they saw him risen from the dead. And they
Okay.
recorded that history.
So what would you say is the oldest consistent batch of manuscripts you can find that depict that story?
The Greek manuscripts that we have of the New Testament.
Okay, and how old are they?
The earliest fragment that we have now dates from 130 AD. It's in the John Rylands Museum in Manchester, England.
I see. And that's, you said oldest fragment.
Right.
How much of a fragment is it? Is it like
It's
a page?
it's just one page of John.
Okay. All right, that makes sense. So would that 130? Would that imply that he wrote it himself?
The reason that I'm convinced that John wrote it himself is because in 110 AD, Clement, Bishop of Rome, in letters that he writes, quotes the Gospel of John.
Okay, so you didn't refer to that as the oldest one because it wasn't actually the New Testament.
Precisely.
Okay, fair enough. Now, I don't want to take up too much of your time, so I want to step back to the second question I had. This one's a little more at a meta level, I would say. Why should we care about whether or not God exists? Why does it make a difference?
Great question. The reason that it makes a difference whether God exists or not is because if God doesn't exist, there is absolutely no meaning and purpose to our lives.
I don't
But if
agree
there
with
is a
that.
God, Well, just read Camus, Sartre, and Nietzsche, and they'll do a far better job than I ever
have.
did pointing that out.
I wasn't particularly impressed with the notion that God gives us meaning through
Okay,
Camus,
how can there
Nietzsche,
be
and
meaning in
Sartre.
life if you and I are basically accidental collections of atoms evolved to a
other.
higher order?
Each other gives meaning to life.
Well, fine. But if I say my meaning in life is to smash his head in, and you say your meaning in life is to love the man, you're not right, you're not wrong, I'm not right, I'm not wrong. It's all relative.
I
It's
don't
all
see
just
how you can say
create
that
it.
because the man's still got his own self to think of, and you're violating that by smashing his head in.
So what?
That's slightly problematic from a philosophical standpoint,
In what way?
in that you're violating his person.
So
You're
what?
going against his will.
So
Are you,
what? I
are
got
you
my own
seriously
will.
telling me that God is the only thing that keeps you from smashing his head in?
No, you've missed the entire argument. Now, please listen more closely. What I'm saying is, if you believe that he is simply an accidental collection of atoms,
Oh, I don't
you
believe
have
he's
no
accidental.
basis for respecting him.
I don't
You can
believe he's
choose to
accidental.
respect him. You can choose to say he has great value. But if in reality he's an accidental collection of atoms, he doesn't have an innate value. But if he's a human being created for a purpose, created by God for a purpose, then whether you like it or I like it or not, he has an innate value that comes from his creator, because he's not an accident. He's been created by God for a purpose. Human worth and value is impossible in an objective sense if there is no God. Obviously, it is, in a subjective sense, it can be true. Subjectively, I am the
Why
greatest.
do you crave objectivity so
Subjectively,
much?
because it's called truth, reality. Subjective is just personal bias, whim, dream.
I still don't understand why you need truth in such a concrete sense.
Because I hate living in a lie. I hate living in an illusion.
The lack of truth doesn't imply a lie. It simply means that you don't fully understand what's happening.
If you understand that there is no creator, if you understand that he is a cosmic accident, then for you to try and argue that he has innate value and
I'm
dignity
not saying he has innate value.
You're up a creek without a paddle, sir. There is no basis for it at all,
I'm not saying that he
other
has...
than your subjective whim.
Well, we talked about interruptions earlier. I mean, I would appreciate if you didn't cut me off.
I share the same feeling.
Okay.
I'd appreciate if you'd stop interrupting me. Fair enough?
Do you accept the Old Testament as also being part of the whole Bible?
I accept the Old Testament as being part of the whole Bible. Yes.
Well, like, Jesus says to be tolerant, but in the Old Testament, God says, kill, kill, kill. You have to kill the Canaanites so you can come in. He tells them, kill them. He talks about genocide. He talks about Holocaust. Kill their children, kill their women, kill their men, kill their sheep, kill their oxen, burn down their buildings, salt their soil so they cannot grow anything. Isn't he telling them to be intolerant? Isn't he telling them to hate and murder? And he goes further with the commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. Isn't he saying isn't that being intolerant? Or at least to other people.
Okay, very good point. Very difficult issue. When you study the Old Testament, you begin to realize that God is good, and his goodness is expressed in both his justice and his mercy. And that's true in the New Testament. I can promise you, nobody talked more about hell than Jesus did. So when we say tolerance, Jesus was tolerant, we do not mean that Jesus said everything's equally valid and God is not going to destroy evil. Because obviously Jesus warned about hell.
Okay,
But I, as a human being, am not to take God's judgment into my hands.
where does evil come from?
It comes from a free will deciding to take a good gift that God has given us and twist it and use it in the wrong way.
But doesn't it say in Isaiah that all things come from God, both good and evil? Doesn't it say in Isaiah that earthquakes and deaths and evil come from him?
No, that the passage about good and evil coming from God, I think if you look at that passage more carefully, it's talking about the judgment of people that you have outlined very accurately.
Well, then,
Comes from God. God judges evil, and you're right. And the Old Testament gives us a record of how God judged the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Amorites. Yes.
so you're saying the Bible should be taken interpretively or literally?
But sir, every book you and I read, we interpret.
So it should be taken.
The question is, how do you interpret, right? And so I would plead with you, interpret the Bible the same way you interpret any book. read in context, respect literary style, ask who's the author, what's the audience, what's the intent of the author, who's the audience the author is addressing, and then interpret fairly.
But what about the revelation of Peter, which today is considered apocrypha, except in the Church of Ethiopia, but back then several bishops it was considered canonical, and several bishops even attested that it was most likely written by Peter himself, in which there is a verse which is actually very much contested among scholars today that says all people will go to heaven. It says in that verse that the people will look down and see the anguish of the sinners and ask God to forgive them, and God will forgive them out of the good in his heart. That's what I lost my train of thought here.
All right, that's good. Great point. All right, now, that's why it's important to study. How were the 27 New Testament books put together? Were they put together by 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 bishops? Were they put together at a council, like the Council of Nicaea, as Dan Brown argues in the Da Vinci Code? No. The New Testament books were not put together by a council or by a bishop or by a pope. The New Testament was put together by the universal church, and one of the criteria that was used was this book has to be acknowledged universally, not just by a little group of bishops somewhere. It has to be acknowledged universally as reliable and authoritative. Otherwise, it was not included in the New Testament.
What do you mean by universally? There was even
From Rome, Italy, down around to Alexandria, Egypt, the known world.
What about Arianism? That was competing with Catholicism in the beginning of the church. The beginning of the church was not unified; it was split up. You
Right.
had Arianism. So how could you say universally they accepted all that? There were bishops who argued against the revelation because they considered it a mere fairy tale.
Right.
And it wasn't during the Council of Nicaea that they actually decided what book goes into the Bible and what does not.
Absolutely no way. The Council of Nicaea had nothing to do with determining the New Testament canon. Nothing. The Council of Nicaea was debating over the identity of Christ, the eternal deity of Christ. That was the issue, not the New Testament canon.
If you say universally, but I'm talking about several bishops, several churches, several branches that actually saw the revelation as
not part of it. That's
not
right.
canonical, and others viewed it. But then how can you say it's universal if you have some churches saying this?
I did not say unanimous.
Or you said universal.
Right.
How can you
meaning by
consider
that churches
universal?
around the known world
But not
agreed that this was acceptable, that this came from an apostle or someone who knew an apostle?
But what? Okay, but then I'm talking about Revelation. Some of the churches said no, that's not. They don't view that as canonical. They see
Right.
that more as
Right.
a story.
Yes.
While other churches view consider apocrypha, Apocalypse of Peter, which says everyone goes to heaven in the end. They consider that as canonical. How can you say it's universal when you have some churches saying no and others
The
saying
vast
yes?
majority of churches around the known world at that time rejected the Gospel of Peter, the Apocryphon of Peter, and they accepted Revelation of John.
So it's not universal. It's the majority. You mean?
That's what I meant. So I'm sorry for my lack of clarity. It was not unanimous, but it was the universal church, meaning by that the church around the world. It was not the church at Antioch or the church at Rome or the church in Jerusalem. It was from Spain down around to Egypt. There was agreement that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were acceptable, authoritative, reliable, and that the Gospel of Peter was not.
And you said earlier about the parallels between the myths or religions and Jesus, and you asked for an example. What about Zoroastrianism? I can't exactly
Yeah,
pronounce it.
Zoroastrianism, yes?
Yes, that was around 1600 BCE. That was before Christ. That was before Christ ever appeared.
Yeah.
And they spoke, but it has parallels to Christianity. Virgin birth, a good God battling evil.
The idea that there is a force of good and a force of evil is very clear. I think you
But how can you explain like the parallels between like miraculous healings or a virgin birth in Zoroastrianism with Christianity? How can you explain those parallels?
well, who's the virgin birth in Zoroastrianism?
Zoroaster or their prophet. I don't exactly remember the name. I think it's Zoroaster or I can't exactly pronounce it. He was
All right.
he was a prophet, and it was said that he came from a miracle birth from a virgin mother. It was said that he could do miraculous healings. How can you explain those parallelisms?
Well, sir, just because there are miracles in different religions doesn't mean they're all wrong. Just because there are miracles in different religions doesn't mean that one borrowed from the other. If you believe in a supernatural God, you're open to a miracle taking place, right?
But then you're not exactly taking. Okay, you're not. Okay, what I'm asking is like, if you take into account the proximity, because Zoroastrianism was in the Middle East, near, and scholars today are mostly in agreement, or at least they're debating it, that it most likely influenced Islam or Judeo-Christian and Islam. It influenced those religions. So how can you say that Christianity is exactly unique when you see all these parallels with religions before? When you see like when scholars today can actually argue that the creation story in the Bible was actually has its roots in Gilgamesh. How you can look at Egyptian religion, the texts of the Egyptian religion, which were thousands of years before Christianity, and had parallels to Jesus' birth and the idea of rebirth and resurrection.
Read the Gilgamesh epic.
I have.
Good. If you conclude that all the Genesis account of the flood is simply a reprint of the Gilgamesh epic, I am dumbfounded. My conclusion would be there really was a great flood, and different cultures tried to explain it in their own language, in their own way. To conclude that there was no flood because we have the Gilgamesh epic and the Genesis account of the flood, I think is unwarranted.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying
What are
that
you
at all.
saying?
I'm asking how you can call Christianity unique. How you can.
Oh, it's very simple.
How you can.
Because
ignore
Jesus
it.
was an historical person who lived, taught, died, and rose from the dead, and nobody else has risen from the dead
But-
historically the way he
but-
has.
But then, Zoroaster has historical perspectives in that case as well. You have no historical proof outside the Bible. Outside of the Bible, there really isn't
So
much
what?
historical proof of Jesus. You're using one text.
No. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, James, Paul, many different individuals. The New Testament is not written by one person.
But those books were written, I believe, around 6 years after Jesus' death. How exactly can you explain that gap? Like, what exactly happened?
All right. Go right back to the book of Acts, 50 days after the resurrection of Christ. Peter stands up on the street of Jerusalem and says, "You killed the Christ? God raised him from the dead." And people didn't stand there saying, "No, this Christ never existed. No, this Christ never died on a cross." They didn't even say, "No, this Christ didn't rise from the dead."
But you don't have any proof except outside the Bible. You don't have any third-person accounts talking anything about Jesus rising from the dead or Paul doing that. In most of the accounts, in most of the third party or other accounts, speak of the Christians as a group. You don't see anything. You don't see any text actually saying Jesus or actually being historic.
You think so? Well, then you need to read
Most of-
Josephus, the Jewish historian. He writes about Jesus as an historical person. You need to read the Mishnah.
Doesn't he write it from a third perspective?
You need to read the Mishnah, which is the Jewish commentary on the Torah, which includes very hostile references to Jesus as a magician, as a false prophet. You need to read some of the writings of the Romans who talk about Jesus and followers of this Christ figure as a real person. So there are other documents outside the New Testament Gospels that talk about Jesus as being a real historical person.
I myself accept that Jesus may have been a real person, but you don't really have any text talking about the miracles he does. You don't have any outside text saying he resurrected.
Okay, so is that what you need to believe in Jesus?
If one of the main tenets of Christianity is he rose from the dead so that I may be forgiven, then yes, because if there's no actual proof outside of the Bible, outside of the sacred text that he rose from the dead, how can you exactly count it to be true? It would be the same as saying Muhammad really went to heaven, according to the Quran.
So what you're asking for is someone who saw Jesus risen from the dead, did not believe in him, and wrote about it.
Did not believe in him, but at least Okay, at least wrote it outside of the Bible. Wrote it as a third
Come on, we've
person.
just been talking about how the Bible wasn't put together until, gosh, the 300s. So there were many independent authors who wrote about this Jesus having died and risen from the dead.
But then
You
where
have
are they?
independent attestation.
Where are those independent attestations?
Matthew, Mark,
Besides
Luke.
those books.
well, what prejudice do you have against those books? They're different, unique
They're
books.
all in the Bible.
Well, that wasn't till the 300s.
I'm asking in the 300s.
When they were first written, they weren't together. You had this document Matthew, you had this document Mark, you had this document Luke, you had this document John, you had this document Romans, and 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. They weren't all in one book. They're different documents. That's exciting. It's fantastic. It's exactly what you're looking for.
What exactly would you characterize sin? What is sin exactly?
You bet. Sin is playing God.
Playing God?
Playing God.
It would not.
Sin is breaking God's moral absolutes.
So breaking his laws.
Sin is not loving God and not loving people. Hating God, hating people, being indifferent to God, being indifferent to people, that is sin.
But
The heart of sin is idolatry. The heart of sin is taking something good or something that's not very good and turning it into the ultimate. For instance, money is good. But to take something good like money and turn it into the ultimate, the reason that I live, that's idolatry. Sin is taking something good, like my mind, a gift from God, making it into the ultimate, being a rationalist and living for my reason. Sin is taking something good, my sexuality, and turning it into the ultimate, living for pleasure, for sexual pleasure. That's hedonism. Those are all different examples of sin. Taking something that could be good or not so good, turning it into the ultimate, and then living for that, instead of living for God and living for people.
so sin wouldn't exactly be disobeying God's laws.
Yeah, sin is disobeying God's laws.
But
Because part of God's laws is, I'm to worship God, I'm not to worship the creation. I'm to worship the creator, not the creation.
okay, but if you break one of God's laws, would that be considered sin?
Yeah.
But
Because if I break one of God's laws, what I'm saying is, God, I have a better idea on how to live my life than you do.
God says in the Old Testament, do not kill. But you see him commanding his followers to kill. You see.
No, the
how would you
commandment is do not
characterize that?
murder. The commandment is not do not kill. It's murder.
Okay.
And God doesn't murder.
Okay,
And if any follower of Christ murders, that's sin. But I can promise you, if I and another follower of Christ walk into McDonald's and there's a guy spraying machine gun bullets into little kids' bodies, and if I hit the guy high and my Christian friend hits the guy low and we break his neck in the process and kill him, that is not murder, sir.
Okay, so-
that is killing motivated by a drive to preserve the innocent from being slaughtered. That's ethically different from murder. Murder is me killing someone because of selfishness, hatred, or revenge.
Okay, well then that proves my point when he tells them to kill the women and children to drive out the Canaanites. Killing them, isn't that ethically wrong?
Okay, you're thinking well. Good point. No. When God chooses to judge a nation, a people group, innocent people get swept up in that judgment.
So as long as God says that genocide and Holocaust is okay.
No.
But that's
God
that's
is
exactly
choosing
what he
to
said.
judge people groups for what they did wrong. And because we're more interconnected than we would like to admit, innocent people were swept along in the judgment.
For what they
He
did.
did not
You mean
hire a
living-
guy to go in there and just wipe out evil adults.
You mean living? You mean by being wrong or doing wrong? You mean by living in a certain area and having a different belief and culture as theirs?
If you do evil, I don't care
He
what
tells-
culture you're in,
he
you are
tells-
responsible to God for that evil, and He will hold you accountable.
He tells the Israelites to kill men, women, children, to commit murder to the women and children because he says because they have different beliefs than you because you must
No,
drive
it is
them out.
not because they have different beliefs.
He
False.
says because they have
It is
false gods.
because they have done evil. They have sacrificed their babies on altars, calling that an act of worship. They have taught people that the way to know God is to have sex with a temple prostitute. And God judged those cultures for the slaughter, the way they slaughtered their innocent children, and for the way they taught people that the way to know God was to have sex with a temple prostitute.
Isn't that intolerant of their culture? That's their
No,
You have
it's intolerant of evil.
You have cultures today that have headhunting, where the only way to become a man is to kill another man.
That's evil.
That's intolerant of their culture. That's basically saying no, because according to my culture, my religion, that's wrong. Isn't that being intolerant?
I can promise you that if you rescue a fellow Homo sapien from being cannibalized by a headhunter, that is good. And if you go into that situation and say, I'm sorry, it's all relative, and if this group of men wants to eat this guy's head, go right ahead, it's just fine because it's your culture.
But no,
that's
but
very
that's
sad.
but that's because it's my own culture. My own culture is not to see that, which means as following my own culture, I should stop that. But I'm still pointing out, like, you're saying God is saying to be tolerant when He shows in the Old Testament to be very, very intolerant of other people. When He tells them if they curse God, kill them. If they don't believe in God, kill them.
Killing Jews came from eugenics, from social Darwinism that teaches that some people are a superior level of the evolutionary cycle, and these Jews and gypsies and homosexuals are an inferior level of the evolutionary cycle. Therefore, to help Nazi Germany move forward, we need to execute homosexuals, gypsies, and Jews. That is the philosophical basis for the Holocaust.
Darwinism came around the early 1900s, late 1800s, I believe.
1859, Darwin wrote Origin of the Species.
Yes, so socialists. But you had anti-Semitism before Darwin. You had anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages.
Absolutely. You had anti-Semitism in the first century.
One of the ideas of anti-Semitism was that they killed Jesus.
Agreed. We agree. Obviously, there's been too much anti-Semitism that has been fueled by an idea that the Jews killed Christ, so we're going to go after the Jews. But I can promise you, that is not what fueled the Nazi Holocaust. When you study Nazism and Hitler, what fueled the Nazi Holocaust was eugenics, racial superiority. Why? Because the clear belief was evolution.
Because
we have evolved to higher levels. And the clear Nazi teaching was blacks, Jews, gypsies, and homosexuals, and handicapped people are inferior levels of the evolutionary cycle. That is the justification for wiping them out.
they saw that, except going back to right and wrong being wrong, they saw that as right. If Nazis controlled the world today, that would be right.
And they would be wrong, I'm convinced. What about you? You think they'd be wrong or not?
That would be relativism.
No. Well, yeah, what you're espousing is relativism.
If the Nazis control the world today,
right,
killing Jews, blacks, anyone non-Aryan or
non-Aryan,
that would be considered right. That would be considered culturally right, and they would see it as fact.
And I would contradict it. And I would hope you'd contradict it. Not because we're enlightened Westerners, but because we have consciences and rational minds that enable us to understand that that is absolutely wrong. I don't care how many people say it's right. I don't care whether my culture says it's right or not.
But then it's relative. It's coming from your own subjective viewpoint.
No, it's coming from a conviction that the human conscience enables us to tie into an objective moral. How can that objective moral exist? Only as if there is a mind prior to the human mind that defines what is right and wrong. There's got to be some type of God.